And now I want to hand it over to the president of Ukraine, who has as much courage as he has determination. Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin. President Putin. He's going to beat President Putin.
Well, of course, the just concluded NATO summit, more like a kind of funeral in Washington, D.C., has shown that a war dementia virus has afflicted the elites of Washington, London, and Brussels. And while Joe Biden's unintentional compliment given to President Vladimir Putin of Russia caused some to laugh, some to cry, what's important is to look at the actual context of the world that we've now entered into, particularly in the aftermath of this recent meeting in Washington. So to discuss this, we're going to go right to the briefing given yesterday by Helga Sepp-LaRouche at her International Peace Coalition meeting that was held yesterday on Friday.
Well, I want to just briefly talk about the NATO summit, which was the 75th anniversary of the founding of NATO. And as it was to be expected, the outcome of it was quite bellicose. And if you contrast the feebleness of the participants with their pretensions, it was already there a huge discrepancy. Not only is the whole world gossiping about the fact that President Biden spoke about Vice President Trump, meaning Kamala Harris, and Ukrainian President Putin in a clear mix-up. So the whole world is wondering if Biden will be replaced at an open convention at the upcoming Democratic Party convention. But also some of the other participants are not in much better shape politically. Macron is pretty much finished in France. Scholz is, weak, to say the least. Others are not looking much better. Nevertheless, this NATO summit, I think, will go down in history of having been an incredibly bellicose event, and not only announcing various things, but basically declaring democracy to be outdated, because they basically say that the conflict with Russia will the oil domain threat Russia poses to NATO will remain for a very long time. So how do they know? How do they know that maybe not the democracy, the electoral process, will bring in governments in Europe, for example, who are of the opinion of Prime Minister Orban that you can negotiate with Russia and you should. So it's a pretension, but what is becoming clear by these statements is that they not only want to make NATO, quote, Trump-proof, meaning that even if Trump would enter the White House in January, that it would not make a difference because they have basically tied oil policies so tightly that even a Trump could not change it. But also other governments would, it wouldn't make a difference if there is an electoral change. Now, obviously, of the many incredible things which were stated in the resolution and otherwise is that China was accused to be the main enabler of the Russian war in Ukraine, which caused already very sharp protests by China. China emphasizing its extremely constructive role in offering a peace plan, which obviously was completely ignored by this NATO statement. But the declaration also declared Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea the enemy, they basically, declared that the NATO will extend into the Pacific. That basically, the confrontation will be there for the good. They also announced that the United States will put long-range missiles into Germany by 2026. Again, there are many elections in between. They completely ignore that. And then these temporary American long-range missiles will be replaced, according to the intention, by a European production of similar long-range missiles, announcing basically a new arms race in the production of such systems. And naturally, these long-range missiles would reach 2,500 kilometers, reaching Moscow from Germany and beyond. And naturally, what this brings back in the memory, at least of some of the older people, is the medium-range missile crisis of the beginning of the 80s, where hundreds of thousands of people were out in the streets, and everybody, including Helmut Schmidt at the time, were extremely worried that we were, just minutes away, 4 or 5 minutes away from a nuclear war. And, that peace movement at that time had a big impact and contributed to a change in the attitude. And one could only hope that the population today is waking up to what incredible danger is existing. Now, it was also said very clearly in the declaration that what is bothering NATO is the Russia supposedly being a threat to the, quote, Euro-Atlantic security architecture, and China being a threat to the Euro-Atlantic security. So the reality is, as we always have discussed it here, the real reason for the Ukraine war, for all of these conflicts, is the fact that a new economic system is emerging whereby the countries of the global south do no longer agree to be kept in a status of colonialism. And because of the incredible Chinese economic miracle, which lifted 850 people out of poverty in China first, and then extended that model with the Belt and Road Initiative to the countries of the global majority, who are now in the process of overcoming their status as, being kept in a de facto colonial condition without access to credit for development. And that is now changing. A new system is emerging, and rather than, taking the stretched out arm and hand, which Xi Jinping clearly did many times, and even Putin in his Eurasian security architecture proposal of June 14th said it is open to NATO members, not specifying which NATO members. But as I said many times, and I'm absolutely certain that if there would be a willingness of the West European countries and even the United States to cooperate with this emerging new order, that would be welcomed absolutely, because the whole fate of humanity hangs on that. Now, if there are these long-range missiles installed in Germany 2026, which is a long time given what the circumstances are, Vice Foreign Minister Ryabkov of Russia has already said that this will have a military response, and that Russia will answer to that in a very calm, measured way, but they will absolutely respond. Now, there is still a lot of time. It's more than, it's almost 1.5 years. So there is plenty of time to, mobilize against that. And fortunately, we have an alternative shaping up, and that is the very respected and, courageous intervention by Prime Minister Orban, who used the fact that Hungary is the EU presidency from July 1st on to start a whirlwind diplomacy on the 1st July, Hungary became presidency of the EU. Already on the 2nd, Prime Minister Orban was in Kiev talking to President Zelensky. 2 days later, he was in Moscow talking with Putin. Then he went on to Beijing, and from Beijing directly talking to Xi Jinping, and then from Beijing directly participating in the NATO summit, being always aware that Hungary is a country with a relatively small population, but demonstrating that even small countries can demonstrate, an independent sovereign policy in cohesion with the interest of Hungary, and for that matter, of many other countries. Now, naturally, in Brussels, there was a complete hysterical outbreak of attacks on Orban, of machinations. How can they possibly shorten the presidency of Hungary, maybe have the next in line, Poland, come in already September 1st? Here you are again, the democracy at work. They bend the rules as they wish. But that is not yet a settled question, because Prime Minister Orban went about it very intelligently. He not only talked to Zelensky, Putin, and Xi Jinping, but he went from Washington immediately to Mar-a-Lago, meeting with Trump, with whom he had already met in March, and also Foreign Minister Shishato had gone to New York several times talking to the young Republicans. So there seems to be clearly an understanding. And Orban also said that he believes that if Trump is the next president, then he would end the Ukraine war immediately. And naturally, Orban has started to make contact and connections to many smaller parties in other European countries who are now represented in affection in the European Parliament. So then he also met on the sidelines of the NATO summit with President Erdogan. They also, even if they are quite on different positions, let's say, towards the Middle East, nevertheless, they agree that there must be a diplomatic solution for the Ukraine war immediately. And remember that it was Erdogan who played a crucial role in the peace negotiations between Ukraine and Russia in March 22, which is really the proof that all the accusations against Putin that he does not want to negotiate and therefore you have to get a resolution on the battlefield are wrong. Because there was the possibility for peace in March 22, which was sabotaged by Boris Johnson. And I want to highlight that point again, because the entire narrative of NATO and everybody supporting this confrontation hangs on the fact that you cannot negotiate with Putin, that Putin wants to reconstitute the Soviet Union, and even beyond, then after he has done that, he would fall into Germany, because Pistorius is saying that Germany has to be ready for the war with Russia, including on German territory, by 2029. This entire narrative is wrong, and the proof of it is that there was a negotiated settlement between Zelensky and Putin in March 22. Now, naturally, the mainstream media, rather than focusing on the one thing which is the real scandal, and that is the absolutely outrageous intervention by Boris Johnson, who went into Kiev and on 9th of April 22 told Zelensky, no deal with Putin, keep fighting. You have the full backing of the entire NATO in the West. And that is why, more than 2 years, this war has been raging on, killing more than 500,000 Ukrainians and many Russians. So rather that the media is focusing on the evil role of Boris Johnson, they stick to the narrative, that Putin would have the intention to reconstitute the Soviet Union, which cannot be proven. There is not one single statement by Putin or anybody else of relevance in a position of power in Russia, which would prove that. So that is why I think the courageous intervention of Prime Minister Orban needs to be supported. And I would really hope that there are many other countries other than Turkey who would, maybe from the global south, from Africa, from Latin America, Asia, would support Orban in his peace mission, because that is, involving China. China has a peace plan offered a long time ago. This was renewed in a joint intervention between China and Brazil. So the track towards peace is not impossible. But naturally, it means that the present NATO summit really needs to be countered, because if that's the perspective, we are indeed on the edge of World War III in the short term. Now, I should also mention, that the situation in Southwest Asia, even if we have focused in the recent period very much on Ukraine, remains a horror show. The genocide in Gaza is escalating. There is a hunger crisis in all of Gaza. This has been reported by all UN organizations. And therefore, I'm very happy to hear that Father Burry will give us an update on his organizing for the Oasis plan, which is absolutely urgent and will only be solved if we go to a global security and development architecture for the whole world. At least that's my assessment. So I think we are in an incredible situation, and it makes very, very urgent that we expand the IPC organizing, and that we really have to make sure that the world knows how incredibly dangerous we are close to World War III, and that people really must mobilize themselves like they did in the beginning of the 80s.
Well, so that was Helga Zepp-LaRouche speaking from yesterday at her meeting of the International Peace Coalition. If you're just joining us, welcome to today's Manhattan Project show. Call it Global Britain, NATO, and Biden call for war. How will you respond? Now, we have a special feature for you today, because we actually have a commentator from the Beltway, so to speak. I think people know him. This is Garland Nixon, political commentator, radio talk show host, and political merry prankster. He's the kind of guy that writes tweets like this: Zelensky has $1.4 billion, more than Will Smith, Chris Rock, and Dave Chappelle combined. Are we to believe that he made that as a comedian in the poorest nation in Europe? Okay, Garland, take it away.
Just one quick question about how long do you want me to be on? Because I've got I can run off at the mouth.
Why don't you do this? To give us a solid 10 minutes, because then we got another person, as you know, Harley will come in and we'll do a little bit of back and forth, right, before you have to go.
Yes. One of the things I think is important for people to watch this is to realize that an important job that we're doing, an important job that the people at Schiller Institution, at the Schiller Institute, et cetera, are doing, is to educate the public. We have to educate the public so that they understand both the danger and the nature of the conflict that we're in. Let me give a perfect example. I have here the NATO statement, and I think everybody should read it, the Washington Summit Declaration. So everyone, I see about 250 people, I think now I've got on my channel. We've got 313 watching, right? All 313 of you people and everybody else that's watching needs to go, and you need to read that. And I tell you why. Because what you understand from that is the importance of the leaders of these various countries, and I use the word leaders guardedly, the importance of misleading the public and of lying to the public, that they can't get away with this if the people actually understand what they're doing and why they're doing it. Let me give you an example, just a little bit, just a few sentences here and there out of NATO's statement. So one of the things they say is, We're bound together by shared values, individual liberty, human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. Well, what do we know? What they're saying to the people of their respective countries is, we're here to do good. This is the quote, liberal intervention. We're here to help. We're here to do good. Human rights. Well, all you have to do is look at their history throughout the world. All you have to do is look at their present right now, what's going on in Gaza, etc., and you will understand that's a lie. They say they're bound by democracy. Well, if you understand what's going on now in Georgia, as they're making an attempt to overthrow the Georgian government to interfere with Georgian democracy. If you understand what's going on in the United States right now, where the party, the incumbent party in the U.S. is basically about to select a nominee with absolutely no input from their voters. That's not democracy. So all you have to do is look at the statements and the claims that are being made in this document and compare this with the actions, with what they're doing worldwide, whether it's in Gaza or in whichever respective country you're in, and you'll realize that they're lying. You go further down. Here's another sentence. Every nation has the right to choose its own security arrangements. Well, let's start in Venezuela. Let's start all over the Western Hemisphere, where the United States has claimed via the Monroe Doctrine that no country, the Monroe Doctrine, it says basically clearly, it's not written out per se, but everyone knows what it is, that no country in the Western Hemisphere has the right to choose its own security arrangement, that only the U.S. can choose its own security arrangements, which is basically the opposite of security. They also say, we adhere to international law and to the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations. Well, again, you look at their actions and you find that, no, that's absolutely not true. And they're committing to upholding the rules-based international order. Well, there is the tell. They're committing to hold. What is the rules-based international order? Can anyone find the rules? No. No, they're not written anywhere. In order to have rules, they have to be transparent. Everyone has to be able to find them, to read them, to know what they are, and people have to have agreed on them, right? If we're going to have a set of rules for a group or an organization, first we need to get together and write them out together. Then we need to make sure that everybody has a chance to read them, and then we can all decide whether or not we all agree in instituting these rules. Well, that's never happened with the rules-based international order, because it is deliberately vague. It is deliberately not even really there. It's simply the U.S. can do whatever it wants whenever it wants. But what's going on here is this. The U.S. now says, we now have a document that says all of our, quote, allies, vassals, colonies, however you want to put them, all of them are committed to basically U.S. hegemony, to do what we want as we please. But if you think about it, the most important thing that NATO has to do, that the U.S. government and the various governments has to do, is lie to their people, because they're asking their people to make tremendous economic sacrifices, cultural sacrifices, all kinds of sacrifices. And we all know it's for an immoral purpose. So really, if you look at this document, a lot of people look at it as, and I've heard people discuss it as, a bellicose document. Where they basically say we're going after China and Russia. But if you really look at it, the first question you have to ask is this: who is this aimed at? Is it aimed at Russia and China? No. Is it aimed at Iran? No. They all know what NATO is, how it works, and what the ultimate plans for NATO is, which is world hegemony for the U.S. empire, for a very particular faction of the U.S. empire, the ruling elite. And various factions of the ruling elite are actually at war with each other right now. But the document was written, and this goes back to the importance of educating the people in the West. The document was written for us. It was written for the people, so that they can hide the truth about what they're doing, so that their evil plans will be interpreted by the people as working for good. Oh, that's a good democracy. Who doesn't want democracy? Who doesn't want human rights? Who doesn't want principles of the charters of the UN? All of those things sound so solid and positive. This was written for us. It's all lies. In the same way that it's critical that the media, the Western media, what do? Who are they talking to? They're talking to us. They're lying to us. As it becomes more and more apparent that the actions of the ruling elite in the West are not designed to improve the lives of the working people throughout their respective countries, and that in fact their actions and their motivations will greatly harm these people, it gets more and more important. It gets critical for them to mislead us. The more we feel pain, the more we see fear of terrible things happening, the more important it becomes for them to have to misguide us, to have to drag us along, and for us to think that we're doing something good. As long as we think we're doing something good, we're part of a greater effort to, save democracy and things like that. We'll go, well, we may continue to go along a little bit longer because their time is short. They know that there are elections coming up all over the place, and that it's not going to be as easy for them to steal the elections around the West as it has been in the past, simply because people are so unhappy and the numbers are going to be so overwhelming. But I think everybody should read this document, because if you understand the nature of the current conflict in Eastern Europe, then it's glaringly obvious to anyone reading this that this is simply a propaganda piece to try to hold on a little bit longer, to try to keep the suckers holding on a little bit longer. Now, let me add this. What we're doing here now is a part of what's I believe what's making a change. Is, many people know that, Viktor Orban, was just discussed by Helga. He's doing, really yeoman's work here and pushing back against the war machine. There is, it has been reported that he's meeting with the Trump people, and that the Trump people are saying if Trump wins, he's going to end this thing. Well, I'm not saying Trump is certainly when it comes to the Middle East and China, we don't know the direction he's going to go, but we don't suspect it's good. But let's face it, you got to crawl before you can walk. If we can get rid of one, I'm not even saying I'm in favor of Trump. I'm saying the work that Orban is doing may help. I'm not in favor of any of the imperialist politicians, any of the warmongers, but it is what it is. We got to play the hands that we're dealt, and we got to hope that some things will happen to mitigate this march towards, World War III and ultimately human annihilation. I mean, and as you go through this thing from one end to the other, you read it, it's clearly basically there was no input from anyone in Europe or anyone in the United States who's outside of the most belligerent neocon factions. They go on to say, Iran's destabilizing actions are affecting Euro-Atlantic security. Well, Iran's trying to mitigate the conflict in Middle East, the genocide in Middle East. So supposedly that's destabilizing the security of Europe. They go on to say, the People's Republic of China's stated ambitions and coercive policies continue to challenge our interests, security, and values. All you have to do, the deepening strategic partnership between Russia and the People's Republic of China and their mutually reinforcing attempts to, listen to this, undercut and reshape the rules-based international order are a cause for profound concern. If you think about that, really, what are they saying? What is the rules-based international order? It is 4% of the world, United States, being in control of the other 6%, and not even 4%. It is a tiny percentage of the American population, a very tiny fraction of a fraction of 1% of the American population being in control of the entire world. So it's not even really U.S. hegemony. It's a tiny fraction of the ruling elite being hegemonic over the world. And if Russia and the People's Republic of China and Iran and anybody else are trying to undercut that, here's the reality. Then we should support that, because I will be honest with you, based on the actions of the U.S. empire over the course of history, to me, any sane or moral person would oppose such monsters, such genocidal thieves and pirates being able to control the world, to run the world, and to hold on to hegemony. And I'll also say this. The big problem that they have, and that we all have, that makes it dangerous, is this. they're trying to hold on to something that they don't even have. That NATO is convincing itself that the US has hegemony, and that Russia and China are trying to undercut this hegemony, and Iran, and they're trying to undercut the hegemony that the US has hegemony, and that they're trying to hold on to something that they have. That would be bad enough. That would be problematic. The problem is that they don't have it. That you go around the world. Ask the people in Africa, are they following the US? No, they're not following the leadership of the US in some rules-based international order. They're fighting to get out from under the thumb of these monsters. Ask the Middle East, the Muslim world, are we trying to go along and work with the rules-based international order? No. As far as they're concerned, and I've had this said, the United States will not decide, and this is what people in the Muslim world say, they will not decide the outcome of the conflict in Gaza. They will not be the ones who determine the standards which we use to come to some diplomatic resolution. That the people in the Muslim world, they demand the right to decide how this conflict is end in their land, and what has to be done in order to have future peace. What boundaries are there? Who can do what? They're saying this is our part of the world, and we should be able to decide how to control it. But China is already far too economically powerful and militarily powerful for the US to confront. We can only screw everything up. So the reality, the real danger that we're dealing with here, and there's a great book called Simulacra and Simulacrum, where what they discuss is people trying to create something in the past, make America great again. Let's go back to the time when, right? And when you talk about trying to create the discussion in this book, simulacrum being trying to create something from the past that never even existed there in the first place. A memory or a thought that you have of the way the past was, and the past was never really that way. And you're trying to create something that never existed. That aligns in this particular context, not exactly in the same way, but from the perspective of this, you're trying to hold on to hegemony when you don't have hegemony. You're trying to maintain control of the world when the world is saying, no, you're not going to tell us what to do. You're not in charge of us. They're saying we will use force and coercion to run the world, to, quote, lead the world. Well, a leader doesn't need force and coercion. A leader leads by example. A leader leads because people say, well, I like what you're doing and I like the direction you're going. I think you'll follow. I'll follow you, rather than the US empire saying, you will do what we say or we'll kill you. That's pretty much it, mafia. Where we are now at this point is they're saying that to all of humanity. Either humanity does what we want or we'll push the suicide button. They're basically diplomatic, political, and military suicide bombers saying we'll get what we want or we'll kill everyone. And I think that the people who are listening to this, who have friends and neighbors, you can direct them to various online alternative media sources. You can direct them to information that you can get to help them to understand the reality of what's going on. So I'll say this as I leave. Everybody that's watching, I don't know how many people are watching here, but on my channel right now, 519 people. Rather than just watch it and walk away and say, wow, that was interesting, that was good, it wasn't good, whatever. It is critical that you share this. And not just this, but when you find something online that is educational in that it helps people to understand the nature of these conflicts, the nature of the US empire, and the rights of others to determine the path for their own future and their own stability and their own economy and their own security in their own nations. When you find these types of things, it is critical that you share these things on social media. That's what we have. We got social media. Now, like it or not, that's what we have. Whether it's emails, whether it's social media, whether it's word of mouth to a friend. Hey, I watched this YouTube show, or I saw the Durand, or I saw whatever it was. You might want to do this. You might want to watch this. We have to point people to alternative media sources that will help educate the public, and make sure you go read the NATO official text of their it's called, let me tell you what it's called. It's called Washington Summit Declaration, issued by the heads of state and government participating in the meeting of the North Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C., July 10, 2024. Go online and find that. It's on NATO's site. Share that with people, discuss it with people, read it so you'll understand the lies and you'll understand the importance of sharing the truth. Thank you very much. And thanks everybody at the Schiller Institute for giving me the opportunity to put in a few good words.
Yeah, but we still got you for another 20 minutes, correct?
Yes.
All right, Rick.
I'm here.
So we're going to go right to Harley Schlanger, and we're going to get into a little bit of a discussion. Harley, you with us there?
Yes, and I have something directly to say to Garland that I thought was quite interesting. Your discussion of a past which didn't exist, but this fantasy that they have. One of the things I read in preparation for my talk was an article by LaRouche in 1997 during one of the previous fights over NATO expansion. And his article was called Miniver Chivi on NATO. And Miniver Chivi, for those who don't know that, is a man who's unhappy with the age in which he lives and wishes he lived in the chivalry times or some other age. And I was thinking that was exactly what you're describing. What Lynn wrote in that, he said, their longing for the past is, in military terms of reference, a flight forward from the realities of the present, which you presented and which Helga presented also. The realities being the emergence of a new order, the rejection of the fraud of the rules-based order. And so here you have these representatives of supposedly leading nations making plans that for a world which doesn't exist anymore. The idea that you're going to save Ukraine, you can't do that by giving them weapons. That's what's destroying Ukraine. The fact that they don't have enough people for their army, the fact that the country is, the idea that it's a freedom and democracy is another one of the frauds. So I think it's very pertinent what you brought up about the psychological failure to face reality, and that's what we're dealing with here. That the other point Lynn made in the beginning of this article is that NATO's expansion, and these are his words. This is from 1997. NATO's expansion is based on warnings against some imaginary future adversary in China, Islam, or ruined Russia. And ruined Russia referring to the fact that the 90s were a period of destruction of Russia and the living standards there. So I think your point is highly relevant, that we're dealing with people who don't live in reality. And what they're trying to do is to get the population to buy into their version of reality, their virtual reality. And for what reason? Because their order is collapsing. The world doesn't like it. They're moving away from it. You have the poorest countries in the world just this last week, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, formed a new strategic alliance because they no longer want the French telling them how to live. They've booted the French out. And now they're finally having an effective war against the terrorists who were supported by the French. So, we can talk more about the specifics, but I think this idea of how people are detached from reality, maybe this is a form of dementia. And I did a column this week on how if you watch the NATO summit and you believe the stories that Biden has suffering from dementia, it appears to be contagious. And maybe the World Health Organization should move in and quarantine all the members of the NATO nation states. So that's the comment that I'd like to make on what Garland had to say.
Garland, before you respond, I'll put this another way, which you may remember the reference. It's an old something from which you may recognize. What a fool believes he sees, no wise man has the power to reason away. Okay, so we can make a meme for those who know that what that refers to of Biden, because that's what you have, this idea of conjuring up a world that never was, but also the fact that nobody's going to get him off this. I mean, this is war dementia. And it is infectious. And what's required, and this is why it's also what you were saying, what people should be doing and sharing this or other information, other things that we can also put up in our own at the bottom of our own screen.
Can I make another comment?
Yeah, please, please.
Another thing, there's a famous story, you know, I study Zen. I don't know if it's a Zen story, if it's just another fable that's been out. You guys probably heard it, but in my study of Zen, I've heard this story. And it is, you know, the infamous story of the girl with the rabbit, right? Where her parent buys her a pet rabbit and she's so happy and she loves this rabbit so much. And they're taking the rabbit home. In the old Zen story, it was in a carriage, right? And she's in the back. In the new one, she's in a car, but she's got the rabbit. Oh, she loves it, and she's hugging, she's squeezing this rabbit. And of course, by the time she gets home, she squeezed the rabbit so much with her love and her, I'll never let this rabbit go. She's telling him, I will never let you go. You're my favorite rabbit. She gets home, the rabbit's dead. She smothered it. Right. And of course, the then perspective is, and a lot of us do this to our significant others and our children and things like that. Right. But here's the other part of it. And that is, I think it's applicable in this context that one of the things that we notice, and this that makes this even more dangerous, when we look at NATO, when we look at the US's attempts to hold on to the disappearing hegemony, everything they do to hold on to it makes it disappear faster. Everything they're doing right now to say we should be in charge, and so we'll start a war here, we'll threaten here, we'll put nukes here, makes people all around the world gasp and say, my God, these people are insane. We don't want this. It makes the people of in all of the nations say, well, we ask this big question. Why is it that we're such a rich country and all the people in the country are getting poor, right? What did Ibrahim Traore, the leader of Burkina Faso, he asked a question, and I said once he asked that question, that's it for U.S. and European imperialism in Africa. He said, why is it that we have all these natural resources, that we're the richest countries in the world, and we're running around the world begging? Right? Once that question was posited to the African people, the answer answers itself, and it's obvious. So I think what we're doing, you know, a lot of times you're doing something that seems like you're not getting anywhere, you know? And so I think one of the things we have to keep in mind, a lot of people, you'll see it in the chat and you'll see it where we don't have maybe the numbers we want on some of these things. And it seems like you're not getting anywhere, right? Tell you a quick story if you don't mind. It'll take a couple of minutes. You know, every little thing you do. So a few months back, I was waiting for some Mexican food, and I'm tweeting, and I made a joke tweet. And the tweet was something to the effect of, it had something to do with Taiwan. Oh, and it was a joke. And it said this, it said, if breaking news, I used to always do these tweets, breaking news. And it said, something about someone in the White House asked Joe Biden if, and I'm just paraphrasing, if anything, there could be any worse disaster than, you know, what's happened in Ukraine. And Joe Biden responded, well, if you think that's bad, where do you see what we have planned for the destruction of Taiwan? It was a joke. It was a joke tweet, but there was a lot of you know, strength to that. Well, little did I know, the Taiwanese, some of the Taiwanese opposition started tweeting it, and it went viral. It went viral to the point where the Taiwanese government and the Chinese government both went to the U.S. State Department and demanded to know more about this statement about the destruction of Taiwan. At one point, it was getting 150 million hits a day on social media in Asia. This thing went berserk. And I was contacted by someone, I won't say who, because people might know his name, who said people from Taiwan contacted him and said that particular tweet did more to educate the people in Taiwan than anything in history, that it was crucial in turning a blah, blah, blah. I was, let's face it, it was a joke. But there was a lot of truth to it, but it was a joke. I mean, here's my point. And it's weird. I mean, if you search right now, anybody right now, search Garland Nixon plan for the destruction of Taiwan, or search Garland Nixon Taiwan, millions, literally millions of documents will come up. It was the Chinese foreign minister at the time was Wang Yi. When he came out to speak for the next day, there was no other questions. Everything from all of the press was, what about this? Who is this Garland Nixon? What about this plan for destruction of Taiwan? Here's my point. it may seem like we're swimming against the tide and we're not getting anywhere. But sometimes just by luck, something is said, somebody shares one of these videos, or maybe even a clip from one of these videos. Somebody takes 30, oh, I like what Harley said, and they take 20 or 30 seconds and shares it as a short or something, cut it out, shares it, and it makes a difference, and it can change history. So my point is, everyone out there, don't think that you're not a part of it, that you're just a viewer, and that all of these things that we're doing on a random Saturday afternoon are a waste of time. These things can really explode and really change the course of history. And it was an accident that that happened with me, and who knows, maybe one of the reasons I'm not on various platforms now. My point being, it's not to say Garland Nixon is some kind of a hero. It was an accident. It was pure absurdity. But everybody, share this stuff, do everything you can, and sometimes you accidentally hit a home run.
To the merry prankster image. Now, everybody doesn't know what that's about, but let's put it this way. There is a way to create, seemingly overnight, a form of resistance that becomes so powerful that it's not able to be controlled. And mostly it happens through humor. Sometimes it happens through a poem. Sometimes it happens because of an inspired moment. Like, for example, some of the interventions that Jose Vega does. You know, nobody knows exactly how these things work. But it captures the imagination of people. And people imagine themselves as doing these things. I had a question for both you and Harley, but also let Harley, if you have something in addition to say, because I think we may as well take the few minutes we've got left, 11 minutes, to deconstruct a little bit the Chinese and the Russian boogeymen. You're pretty good at that, Garland. You have a lot to say about it. So why don't we start with you, and then we'll have Harley come in and comment.
Well, you know, the bottom line is this: it is important. You know, I used to do a show with a guy who knew Steve Bannon very well, and he knew the people over there at Breitbart. And he said, you know, when he talked to Steve Bannon and he was writing things, Bannon would always say to him, "Heroes and villains, heroes and villains, heroes and villains. When I read these articles, when I see the stuff you want, I want heroes and villains," because he understood. And I mean, it's plain and it's simple, but it's very, very effective. And so in order to justify evil things that we're doing, we have to be the hero. We have to put that the U.S. The leaders have to put a mindset into the people that they are part of a group of people who have come together to protect the world and save the world from some kind of a universal evil. And so what happens? You have to turn the leaders of the country. It's just not even a country anymore. It's not. Russia's not a country. There's only Putin. Syria's not a country. There's only Assad. China's not a country. There's only the Chinese Communist Party, Chi-Com. And so it even goes to a point where to the level of absurdity where it becomes, and we've got to protect the world from these evil people, and we've got to protect their people from their evil leaders. Putin's evil and China's evil, and the people there have no rights, and they got nothing, and they're unhappy. And for some reason, 87% of them like the government. And then that has to be because they're stupid and ignorant, right? And so you understand that this is just a game. It's a Marvel a hero story of these evil people, and what happens, what's important, Bonapartism. I don't know if people have ever heard about this term Bonapartism, right? And it's not about Napoleon Bonaparte. It was actually his nephew, I believe it was, that was involved in politics. And basically it was a concept that's like this: when the ruling elite fight, they have to enlist the aid of the working class. So they'll get groups of the working class to join this faction of the ruling elite versus groups of the working class that are enlisted to the machinations of that factions of the ruling elite. So they can take groups of the working class to fight their battles with the factions of the ruling elite. That's the same game on an international level. And now they recruit the working class to fight a war that ain't their battle. I think, was it the communists or the socialists or something used to have big signs that said, we won't fight no rich man's war. Some of you guys are probably familiar with those signs they would wear that said, we won't fight no rich man's war. And the other one was like, rich men make the war and poor people die in it, whatever the case may be. Again, it comes back to what we were saying earlier, and that is the demonization of your enemies, creating an environment, creating a dynamic in which the working class, who is suffering at the hands of these oppressive neocons, suffering at the hands of this vicious, brutal ruling elite, somehow gets hoodwinked into thinking that Elon Musk and Bill Gates and these other guys are that they're working with them against some overseas evil. And it's critical because they don't have another option, because your life is just going to get more and more miserable.
Okay. Harley, any comment?
Well, one of the things I like about Garland is he appreciates irony. And the examples he's giving are precisely that. And, you know, if you look at the so-called establishment, you look at someone like Blinken. I don't think Blinken understands that people are laughing at him. You know, he goes to South Africa and starts lecturing about LGBTQ. And the foreign minister of South Africa says, Mr. Blinken, we're a sovereign nation. Don't come here and lecture us. And he walks away as though nothing happened. He doesn't get it. And, you know, I've talked a number of times about this problem of the arrogance, which is part of the detachment of the establishment. They think that because of who they are, they can get away with what they're doing. Another example of this was during Freedom of Press Day, which is, I can't remember exactly when it is, but the State Department had an event on Freedom of Press Day, and one of the reporters wanted to ask them about Assange. And when he brought it up, they escorted him from the room. So here you have Freedom of Press Day, when if there should be freedom of press, something should have been said about Assange. And instead, by raising it, the person was removed from the room. So Garland, I think one of the points you're making is if people know enough, if they actually dig into these stories to figure out what's going on and start to see how crazy this establishment is. And you're right, it's a suicidal mission. The approach they're taking on Ukraine of extending the war into Russia could lead to nuclear war. Don't they see it? Don't they know it? Well, they're hoping you don't know it and you don't see it. And that's why it's important, even if only one person is telling the truth, it's got to get out there.
If I may add something also, and this is the really crazy part of it, because you said it could lead to nuclear war. But think about this, everyone who listens, think about this for 1 second. Russia has a very specific nuclear doctrine that says if there's a danger to the Russian state, if somebody's trying to destroy Russia, if somebody is trying to tear Russia to pieces, we'll kill you. You know, which is the nuclear doctrine of all nuclear countries. If you try to take this country out, we'll fight. But if it gets to the point where we're going down, you're a dead man. And that's a deterrent idea. Hey, don't try that because we'll kill you. Yeah, we'll probably die too. But and Putin even said it. He says, well, we're Christians, we'll go to heaven and you won't. Regardless of how you look at that, it doesn't matter what happens after you're dead. That's not a discussion that I think we really need to have while we're still alive. And we're trying to keep people alive as long as possible. So my point is this. The very specific policy of NATO is what? A strategic defeat of Russia. And they have literally had conferences in Europe where they've talked about what they refer to, everyone look this up, the decolonization of Russia. And what does that mean? It means what they had. I think there was a conference, I believe, in Belgium in the 1860s where they talked about Africa, how they're going to split Africa up, who's going to get which part of Africa, right? Basically, they already had that conference for Russia. And they said, we'll decolonize Russia, mainly meaning we'll tear it up into different parts and everybody gets a part and you'll get some oil, and you'll get some gold, you'll get some nickel, you get the area that raises wheat, whatever the case may be. So the specific policy is to Number one, strategically defeat Russia. Number two, to tear Russia to pieces. But compare that with Russia's nuclear doctrine, which says, if you accomplish that, we'll nuke you and kill everyone. So their policy, it's not may lead if they, well, luckily for us, they do not have the military wherewithal or economic wherewithal at this time to complete that. If they had the economic and military wherewithal to complete the goal, to accomplish their goal, the very accomplishment of their goal would kill every one of them, and us included. The true madness is, that's like me saying, Garland, what are you doing? Well, I got a rope here. What are you going to do? Well, I'm learning how to make a good knot, and I got a nice strong rope. I'm going to throw it over that limb. I'm going to put the other end around my neck, and then I'm going to jump off this table. And what happens then, huh? Not thinking that the very actions that I'm taking, I may be the best person at making knots. Buy the strongest rope in the world and a nice oak limb that wouldn't break, that would support my weight. But I'm not having the discussion that if I accomplish my goal, it's going to break my neck and kill me. That's literally what they're doing. They're taking the actions of human suicide, to end all humanity, if they accomplish what they want. That's the obscenity of the leadership that we have right now. And that's why it's important that we teach people, that I'm not going to say that we simply expose people to the truth. They don't need to be taught. They just need to. Teaching implies that we're teaching them a skill or that there's some secret knowledge or ability. No, all we got to do is expose people to the truth, and they'll figure out for themselves that they have leaders who are hell-bent on committing suicide for the human race.
Yeah. So, well, we're getting close to time here with respect to you, Garland. I wanted to say this, though, because you brought up what people should be doing, because the dissemination of what we're talking about, the fact that you went through this analysis of the NATO document, and that people should read the NATO document and discuss the NATO document, since this thing was actually passed, quote, in their name, so to speak, is very important. Also, you do your podcast. Harley, of course, is very involved in the same way. We have our Executive Intelligence Review Alert Service. We'll just bring up for a minute on the screen kind of the 10 principles for the strategic new international security and development architecture. Just available from our organization. That's Helga Sepp-LaRouche's specific 10 points for what should be done in this circumstance to negotiate. So I guess the final thing I'd like to ask you, Garland, before you go, is you've already made the point that individual actions can have a disproportionate leveraging power in catalyzing actions by even governments. So when you look at the situation in today's United States, where there's no president, for example, there's a constitutional process that perhaps could be used around the 25th Amendment and so on. But the question is, even that would be like a gimmick, in the sense that what you really had to talk about a new set of policies and a new set of priorities. So as the American citizens who are watching this depart from what we do here, what do you think has to be their orientation toward this moment? Because obviously we can't be talking about something in November when we're dealing with the kind of situation we have right now.
I think their orientation needs to be two things. So number one, let me add this about the 25th Amendment. Even if the 25th Amendment was invoked, it would have to go to Congress, and the Republicans would get a vote. And let's face it, I'm pretty sure they want to face Joe Biden. So I doubt very much if they would vote in favor of removing Joe Biden from office, because, I mean, if you were running, who wouldn't want to run against this guy, right? But I think that in this moment, what people have to do is to understand is this. There's a huge, when the machine is in trouble, think about this. What does a tank do on the battlefield? It tries to put up smoke all over the place so that, you can't see it and it can leave. What does a airplane do when it feels like, it's being targeted? It drops chaff. It drops these hot pieces of metal that burn really hot, or little teeny pieces of tin foil, right? What does it do? It wants to distract whoever's targeting it. It wants to make you look in the other way, the direction, think about other things, so that you won't focus on what's happening. We have people right now, and I'll tell you this, I'm on Facebook. Facebook is constantly creating fake accounts. And these fake accounts are 2025, the Republicans 2025, right? Stuff like that, right? If Trump gets involved, he's going to do this. And they create distractions so that we can argue about Project 2025. I read Project 2025. I'm familiar with the Republican Party. It's no different than Project 2015, 2005. It's standard Republican policies, right? But now they've added something to it to be horrifying, and they put up constant fake posts to distract you from the danger. So I think what's important right now is people understand, don't get caught up in all the discussions about Joe Biden. Does he have dementia? Is he coming or going? Is this Project 2025? How can we fix a system that's fundamentally broken and unfixable at this time? When you got, sharks swimming behind you, you got to get out of the water and then think about later how you can, you know what I mean? You have an existential threat. First, you have to deal with the existential threat, and then you can talk about Project 2025 or anything else. So I think in the context of the discussion that we're having, which is we've got leaders who are threatening the existence of humankind, that we have to make sure that our priority is addressing that, and that we don't get caught in the distraction and machinations of the machine to try to keep us arguing amongst each other, to try to keep us focusing on everything but getting together to stop nuclear confrontation, opposing genocide in Gaza, all of the things of that nature. So that's what I would say to people. Forget these distractions. Don't post anything about Project 2025 or, the latest Trump or Kamala Harris gaffe. Yeah, it's fun. As I said, what's the old joke? It's like peeing yourself, like peeing yourself in a dark suit. You get a warm feeling, but nobody really notices. The reality of this stuff. The main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. Right now, we have to oppose these nuclear confrontations, and we have to come together as a block of people who are opposed to this stuff. Let it be known, spread the information that we can, and stand up and fight it, because the rest of the stuff won't matter if we are not allowed, if we're not able to stop these existential extinction level confrontations. One last thing I'll say, if you think about Joe Biden's speech, at the end of the speech, people were like, did you hear that he stuttered on this person? He called that person the wrong name. And my position was, what about the content of his speech?
Yeah.
He said, Putin wants to go to Poland afterwards and the Baltics, and he won't stop till he gets to the English Channel. Okay, I'm paraphrasing a little bit. But My point being, the content was, if that were true, that would mean that the Europeans had to go to war, and then we got World War III, and we all died in a nuclear holocaust. Forget all of the stumbling and bumbling that you can laugh and joke and talk about. The reality is the content of that was extinction level, and we've got to continue to focus on this extinction level rhetoric and extinction level actions.
Okay, very good. Harley, did you have something you were trying to say? Just wanted to.
No, I think that covers it. The point of mobilizing to stop the danger of nuclear war is what people should be focused on. And I appreciate your emphasis on that, Garland.
Garland, thanks for giving us the time today. It's very clear. We'll make sure that we get this out to everybody and make sure that we get you back on again a little bit more, do a little bit more work. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot. And I'm going to leave this up. Guys going to be on another hour or so?
Approximately, yes.
I'm going to leave this up running on my YouTube channel. Right now, I got 703 people on my YouTube channel watching this, plus the numerous people that you guys watch. Right. So thank you for your important work. I got to run right now, but I'm going to continue to leave this running on my YouTube channel until you guys are done.
Okay, real good. Thank you. Okay.
All right. Thanks a lot. Bye.
All right. So, Harley, you're now on. Tell us what you got to say.
Well, I actually am going to start with the NATO communique. And I have slightly different quotes than the ones that Garland did. But let's start with what Biden said. Russia will not prevail in this war. Ukraine will prevail in this war. And we will stand with them every single step of the way. That's what the compact says loudly and clearly. Now, when you read it, the compact is a draft for permanent war because NATO intends no negotiations. just as they sabotaged the March-April 2022 agreement reached by Russia and Ukraine, they continue to push for war as opposed to a negotiated settlement. So let me have the first post, please. This is a section from the compact, or from the compact of NATO, the NATO program. Okay. It says, today we announced the Ukraine Compact with a view towards coordinating and accelerating our collective efforts to meet Ukraine's comprehensive security needs as outlined in the joint declaration and in the security agreements and arrangements each of the signatories has completed with Ukraine. In other words, all the side deals made to fund Ukraine's so-called war needs. Goes on to say, through this compact, we declare our enduring intent and commitment to ensure Ukraine can successfully defend its freedom, independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity today and deter acts of aggression in the future. This is a document of permanent war, and it's clear that that's what NATO was talking about. Now, let me have the next post, because the immediate reaction of Russia was very clear. The Russian ambassador to the United States, Antonov, said, anyone who refuses to submit to the dictates and will of the West is declared an enemy. Russia is again identified as the primary threat. NATO's policy of refusing serious negotiations with our country was confirmed. The United States does not want to seek compromises and demands that we meekly agree with the movement of the alliance's military machine to the east. And he exposed the ultimate intent of what is going on here, where he said, peace in Ukraine is viewed through the prism of Russia's strategic defeat. Now, this is important because then you look at what Ryabkov said. I think this is the next post. Ryabkov, who's the deputy foreign minister, said that those attempting to expand NATO into a global military force will pay the price for such ambitions. They persist in their delusions, persist in their sins. They will get what's coming to them, unquote. Now, this is very clear if you hear what was said on the one side of NATO planning a permanent war, and then the Russians basically calling that out, saying that's what it is, and we're not going to tolerate that. We're going to have to defend our security and our future. Now, what I want to go through is some examples that go back to the 90s, when this debate on NATO expansion around the question of Russia was one of the leading issues in the world. But if you go through the reports from the National Archives, you'll see that they've now declassified memos that show that the Russians were trying to become a part of NATO, as Putin has said he wished to do, a partner with the West, and that the presidents and the leaders of the West were saying to the Russians, yes, 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 we understand that, we want to do that, we want to accommodate you, even as they were planning an expansion to the very borders of Russia as a threat to Russia. And keep in mind, this was occurring in the 90s. What was the policy towards Russia in the 90s? It was what Garland just said. Dismantle it and grab the raw materials, grab whatever industry is useful, and break the country apart. It was committed to a destruction not just of Soviet communism, but of Russia, which is the intent behind the policy for the last 70 years of NATO, the last 75 years of NATO. They just had their 75th anniversary. The intention has always been the British geopolitical intention of making sure that Russia and Eurasia are not unified in any way or involved in any partnership with Western Europe, especially Germany and Russia must be separated and turned into enemies. And so when you look at I'll just give you some of the quotes from the discussions that went on then about NATO expansion. You'll see that there are no good guys on the US side. That the language of the US saying, well, we want to have peace, we want to give you an opportunity to emerge as a free and democratic country. At the same time, they were plotting to tear Russia apart. And the reality is that they nearly did. They nearly succeeded, because the economic policies that were imposed in the post-Soviet period reduced the population of Russia. It lowered the average age of lifespan of Russian people, especially men. It destroyed an industrial base that while maybe not comparable to the base of Western Europe, could have been built upon by credit and investment from Western Europe, which is what Lyndon LaRouche and Helga Zepp LaRouche were proposing. Instead, it was a one-way flow of loot out of Russia. So keep that in mind when you hear the discussion about NATO expansion, that occurred at a moment when the intention was clearly to destroy what existed as a Russian state and to steal whatever they could. So let me have the next post. This is when the Soviet Union was still there, was still existing, there were negotiations as to what would be done with Germany. Could there be a unified Germany? Would that be a threat to Russia? Would Russia accept it? And so this was a discussion topic in many meetings, and here's one from February 9th, when Shevardnadze, who was the Russian foreign minister, met with James Baker, who was the US Secretary of State. And Baker said the US was striving for a united Germany that would remain firmly tied to NATO. But he promised at the same time iron guarantees that NATO jurisdiction or forces would not move eastward. Now, this has been one of the controversial issues because, as you'll see, there were many people who said this, but because it was never written down in a specific treaty or guarantee, they claim it didn't exist. So let's look at what happened next. Later that day at a meeting with Mikhail Gorbachev, Baker acknowledged that it is important for the Soviet Union and other European countries to have guarantees that the United States maintains its presence in Germany within the framework of NATO. So there will be no extension of NATO's jurisdiction or military presence by a single inch in the eastern direction. That's what James Baker said, not a single inch. And Gorbachev replied, the expansion of the NATO zone is unacceptable. And Baker agreed with this. Now, what I'm quoting from are documents from the State Department and from the United States that are in the National Archive. And you'll see that there's a fairly rich discussion process which went on to try to reassure Russia that we really do want to be friends with you, even as the plan was to extend NATO closer and closer and closer to Russia and treat Russia as a belligerent, and recognizing that Russia will become belligerent if you keep stealing their resources. Now, the next one was shortly after the meetings we just saw with Shevardnadze, Baker, and Gorbachev. Put up the next post, please. Hans-Dietrich Genscher, who was the German foreign minister, then met with Edward Shevardnadze. This was on the 16th of February, 1990. And Genscher said, it is clear to us that membership in NATO creates difficult problems. However, one thing is clear to us. NATO will not expand to the east. And then 2 days later, Genscher was in Washington for a press conference with James Baker. And in Baker's presence, he said, as I said, NATO has no intentions of expanding to the east. So this is what they were saying to the Russians. Now, what were the Russians saying back? Well, let's have the next post, please. Yeltsin wrote a letter on December 21st, 1991, asking for Russia to have membership within NATO. And what he said in the letter is, this will contribute to creating a climate of mutual understanding and trust, strengthening stability and cooperation on the European continent. We consider these relations to be very serious and wish to develop this dialogue in each and every direction, both on the political and military levels. Today, we are raising a question of Russia's membership in NATO, however, regarding it as a long-term political aim. So there you see the discussion process coming from Russia, and this continued. Now, it was clear at that point that there was a group of people in the State Department were pushing to expand NATO and certainly not to include Russia. While President Clinton was saying, well, we want to do things that will be comfortable for Russia. So there was a meeting with Yeltsin that Clinton had in September 1994 at the White House, and Clinton emphasized inclusion, not exclusion. And then Clinton went on to say, NATO expansion is not anti-Russian. It's not intended to be exclusive of Russia, and there's no imminent timetable. The broader, higher goal is European security, unity, and integration, a goal I know that you share. So that's what he said to Yeltsin. Now, at the very same time, the Assistant Secretary of State for Europe, Richard Holbrooke, was involved in speeding up the NATO expansion discussions, even initiating a NATO study in November of the how and why of new members. And Yeltsin, when he was informed of this, sent a letter to Clinton in the end of November 1994, saying, one completely fails to understand the reasons behind a new revitalizing of the discussion on speeding up the broadening of NATO. And as you can see, this was increasingly an existential question for the Russians. Now, what happened then is the proposal was made to establish something which was called the Partnership for Peace, which was meant to, as a pathway to NATO, a road to NATO. What did the countries from Eastern Europe have to do to become NATO members? And by implications also, Russia should join and go down the same pathway. Now, what Clinton said in January of 1994, after this Partnership for Peace was set up, he said, this is the track that will lead to NATO. And he told Yeltsin, there's no timetable. But the point is, it's not whether, but when. In other words, it will happen. It's going to happen. Now, in this context, there was some resistance from some of Yeltsin's government officials. The foreign minister, Kozyrev, refused to sign the Partnership for Peace. And on December 5th, Yeltsin, at a meeting in Budapest, confronted Clinton directly. And he said, why are you sowing the seeds of mistrust? Europe is in danger of plunging into a cold peace. History demonstrates that it is a dangerous illusion to suppose that the destinies of continents and of the world community in general can somehow be managed from one single capital. In other words, the unipolar order is not a good idea, is what Yeltsin was saying to Bill Clinton then. Now, you might say, was this generally known that there was this battle going on, the Russians disagreeing with the idea of the expansion of NATO? Well, I think many of you are familiar with the Niet means Niet memo written by former Russian ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Russia, William Burns, in 2008, when he said, no means no, Russia will not accept Ukraine in NATO. Well, there was something similar in October 1993 from a top official in the Russian embassy, the US embassy in Russia, James Collins, who later became the ambassador to Russia. And he wrote a memo which said, if NATO adopts a policy which envisions expansion into Central and Eastern Europe without holding the door open to Russia, it would be universally interpreted in Moscow as directed against Russia, a policy of neo-containment. So again, this was known. It was known to the people who were making the policy. And at this time period then, you see, I have one more document here, the Yeltsin-Clinton meeting in May 1995. The next post, please. This is when Clinton went to Moscow to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the victory in World War II, before the decision was made that this should no longer be done. Now, the MEMCON, which is the memo that was produced of the one-on-one meeting, features repeated Yeltsin objections. I see nothing but humiliation for Russia if you proceed. Why do you want to do this? We need a new structure for pan-European security, not old ones. But for me to agree to the borders of NATO expanding toward those of Russia, that would constitute a betrayal on my part of the Russian people. And then Clinton tried to smooth talk him. He said there would be gradual, steady, measured NATO expansion. You can say you don't want it speeded up. I've told you we're not going to do that. But don't ask us to slow down either, or we'll just have to keep saying no. But then Clinton tried to assure Yeltsin, I won't support any change that undermines Russia's security or redivides Europe, and urged that Yeltsin join the Partnership for Peace, which the Russians did. But what happened then is that within the next 3 years, you had, first of all, NATO bombing Yugoslavia, which the Russians saw as an attack on a fellow nation, an unacceptable attack. And it was done under completely contrived circumstances. And we really need to do more to look into this. But when they say that there was, you hear this from Stoltenberg and von der Leyen and others, it's not acceptable to change the boundaries. Why is it that some countries think you can change boundaries? And they say that to Putin about Ukraine. Well, what happened in Yugoslavia? The boundaries were changed. NATO recognized three breakaway republics, and then bombed Yugoslavia to defend the breakaway. So again, you see the hypocrisy and the irony in this. Now, finally, what happened is that by 1998-99, Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic were brought into NATO. And the process then has been unstoppable. Romania, many, many other countries. And again, remember, this occurred at the time of an economic assault against Russia, and also the stirring up of so-called Islamic uprisings in the Caucasus. And as we know, the so-called Islamic terrorist networks have been supported by MI6, the British, by the CIA. This is the old British strategy. This is Brzezinski's strategy of the Islamic card. And so you have this all-out assault on Russia in that period. And finally, Primakov, the Russian prime minister, said no more of this, stood up and insisted on change. And shortly after that, Putin was brought in as the president. Now, if you look at this brief summary I've given of the 1990s, you see that the argument that you can't trust anything the Russians say, well, if you look through the documents, you see that what they said is what they did. the country that told lies was the United States, the leaders of the United States. Then let's zoom ahead to 2014. What happened there? Again, lies. The lies that eventually were consolidated into the Maidan regime change coup. The idea that it was a democratic revolution against a tyrannical regime. And after that, the lies that there were no Nazis involved, when in fact, whole sections of the military of Ukraine marched behind banners of Stefan Bandera, who was a World War II Ukrainian who brought Ukrainians into the Nazi party and into the Nazi SS to fight the Russians. And that those forces still exist under the same banners and the same symbols. And now they're in the Zelensky government. So we see the West time after time after time betraying the trust that the Russians were giving them. And another example is Minsk, where the agreement on paper said that there would be autonomy granted to the eastern Ukrainian provinces and that the fighting would stop. And what happened? We find out later that Merkel and Hollande, who are two of the guarantors of this, the Chancellor of Germany and the President of France, admitted that it was a time-buying measure to build up the Ukrainian army. So when you hear that the intervention of the special military operation by Putin was unprovoked, what's clear is that that's just another lie. It was constantly provoked, and that the Russians are being provoked again, because instead of negotiations, instead of a peace process, instead of the idea of mutual security guarantees, including Ukraine as a neutral country, not in NATO, the refusal to even take those seriously was the provocation that ended up in this war, which is destroying Ukraine and puts us on the verge, especially as the missiles keep going into Ukraine and they're longer and better targeted missiles targeting sites inside Russia. The closer we come to an accidental setting off of a thermonuclear war. And yet what we hear is that it's Russia's fault and that the free nations of NATO and the European Union have to stand together to stop Putin from marching across Europe. Now, one final note here on Joe Biden. In the 1990s, during these discussions of NATO expansion, Biden was the top Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he was a very strong advocate of NATO expansion. When the Senate voted in 1998 on the expansion of NATO, of adding Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, Biden said, quote, "This is the beginning of another 50 years of peace," unquote. As usual, he was wrong. The Washington Post, reporting on that vote, described Biden as a key player in the ratification effort of the expansion of NATO. So if you take this question of Biden's mental competence, one has to go back and ask the question, was he ever mentally competent? And how does someone who has the kind of problems that we see in Biden today, the issue is not, can he beat Trump in November and should he be inaugurated if he does in January? The question is, how do you have someone who confuses Putin and Zelensky, who confuses his wife and his sister? How do you have someone like that who has his finger on the nuclear button? And what's clear is that as part of the same disinformation that dominates everything we get out of Washington, it's not Biden who's running the country. And the fact is that the people who are running it in the intelligence and security forces and the State Department are people who were involved over the last 30 some years since the collapse of the Soviet Union in pushing for a policy of breaking apart Russia, looting Russia, and destroying it as an independent sovereign nation. And that's why we have to look at this latest summit as just another move toward the permanent war, which risks going to nuclear war. And that's why the International Peace Coalition is mobilizing to take up the peace initiatives from Putin, from Orban, from the Chinese, to have a negotiated settlement before we get into World War III. So, Dennis, that's my report.
Thank you very much for that, Harley. And just want to say for everybody that's watching, a lot of people are watching, some questions are coming in. And so we're going to do something a little bit different today because what we have already presented from the beginning of our show through this conclusion gives you a kind of weapon that we need you to use. We need you to deploy it. Now, there are several things and kind of what you can do. We don't need to see it right now, is to bring up our Declaration of Independence Against Nuclear War statement. We refer people to something that the Schiller Institute put out. You take a look on your site. I'll reference it more in a moment. But it's basically a statement that was written and signed by several people involved at the let's say from military intelligence and diplomatic circles that recognize the razor's edge we're on right now. We'd like you to circulate that statement, sign that statement and circulate it. Secondly, 50 years ago, the Executive Intelligence Review magazine was founded by Lyndon LaRouche. It was in April of 1974. And it was the writers for the magazine were not, quote, professional intelligence people or specialists at all. They were graduate students and students of the LaRouche movement of that period, most of them in their early 20s, mid 20s. Over a course of approximately 3 years, we were able to develop what was later called by a not so reputable character, Norman Bailey, at that point at the National Security Council, the best private intelligence agency in the world. And we are inviting all of the people that are watching now who want to answer a critical question to essentially be drafted into our rejuvenation and expansion of that Executive Intelligence Review work. So you have to face the fact that right now, nobody exactly knows who's running the country. You certainly don't know, and I don't know. There are various forms of, quote, secret government, such as the continuity of government, which is an actual form in which some 100 plus individuals are designated to stand in for the functioning federal government. And we ran into that during the trial of Lyndon LaRouche, particularly in the form of the person of Buster Horton, who was the foreman and the jury of the trial for Lyndon LaRouche. We found that he was part of this 100-person committee, which included people like Oliver North. And they were supposed to run the country, quote, in the event of a national emergency. So there are various of those kinds of forms, but that doesn't really tell you what's exactly going on. And we, the American people, have to find out who's actually running it. This is not a question of some long-term project. This is a question of understanding who is actually influencing the question of how this Nato document, which is actually in effect supposed to supplant the American presidency, will be used to, in fact, if you not to catalyze, but to justify the entry of the United States into a full-scale war, both with Russia and with China. And we are going to have that happen. That's not going to be contingent on an election. We can talk about it. You can talk about it if you want November. But frankly, discussing November by itself is sort of criminal insanity. That's the statement. You can go to the Schiller Institute site and see it there. Petition of the International Peace Coalition, Declaration of Independence from Thermonuclear War. So it's useful to go up and take a look at that. It essentially calls for, starting from the standpoint of the proposed negotiation, which Vladimir Putin proposed on June 14th. The issue is not whether you affirm or fully agree with that declaration. The important of the idea was to since this was offered by Putin to then sit down and have discussions. That's what, of course, Viktor Orban has done. He assumed his position as the president of what's called the European Commission on July 1st, and by July 2nd was in Ukraine. By July 5th, he was in Russia, and then by about July 8th, 9th, went to China, and then went down and went to Mar-a-Lago. Also came to Washington to participate in the NATO summit. The purpose of that whirlwind diplomacy of his is to try to actually seriously address this danger of thermonuclear war. And he is acting in that sense on what we call the presidential principle, that the idea is that you've got to allow the American people and the people of Europe to all be part of the deliberation. The thing that Garland did when he went through and just broke down, and then Harley, of course, did something similar. The NATO document is exactly the kind of process that everybody in the country needs to be involved with. What I want to do now is to play something from yesterday, because this will drive us toward a certain kind of conclusion. There was a discussion or an interchange between Helga Sepp-LaRouche and Jose Vega. Jose Vega is an independent candidate for Congress from the 15th Congressional District. He's running this year. And this was this kind of flowed out of a discussion that was happening about the issue of intervening, of standing up for yourself, and then what happens when you do that, and why one should be not just proud to do that, but under what, how under conditions of adversity you keep going. So we're going to play that for you now and take a comment from Harley about it.
Intervene here myself. I saw that the French were doing interventions, and you played the videos earlier, and I think that's honestly a great. The independence movement here that we have started here in the United States is not something that's limited only to this country. Of course, it's an international movement, and it's an international process. And it's something that's composed of voices, not just independent candidates, although candidates can be included in that. What supersedes it is voices of just people from different countries speaking up in the face of injustices and lies. And if we had hundreds of people speaking out here in the United States and in other parts of the world, you may actually have a government. If people were just telling the truth about the fact that we don't have sorry, I'm not speaking Spanish, I'm speaking English. Here we go. If we just had people telling the truth and speaking out about the fact that, there is no presidency right now, because that's really what should be frightening people right now, is the fact that the person who they so-called elected is not the person who's making the decisions for them. There should be a investigation as to who exactly is. And this is something that's on display for the entire world. And I just want to speak on the idea of intervening to begin with. There is a quote here by Fannie Lou Hamer. I had a discussion with somebody yesterday about what should they do if they're actually afraid or scared to actually intervene. And I'm trying to find the exact quote here, but Ray McGovern actually gave us some good advice too. And he quoted Fannie Lou Hamer, and I believe the exact quote was something like, here we go, I got it right here. It was something like, sometimes it feels like to tell the truth today is to run the risk of being killed. But if I fall, I'd fall 5 feet 4 inches forward in the fight for freedom. And anybody who's ever done an intervention before, you do feel that kind of fear, and you ask yourself, well, why aren't more people intervening? And they have, actually, ever since the process that we started 2 years ago with my friends and I, and Anastasia, who's also an intervener, where we kind of broke the social mold and said, you know what, it's okay not just to intervene, but to tell the truth. We've seen a big uprising and uptick in interventions, especially since October 7th. people talking about the fact that there is a genocide, people intervening and interrupting and increasing the tension, not just here in the United States, but around the world. And so I would just say to people that, who may feel nervous or afraid about their careers or what their family would think of them, I would actually ask Helga to kind of talk about this a little bit more, about the context of our lives. Not to, the way I see it is that, and I don't mean to sound harsh, but a lot of what people do today could be perceived as meaningless. The meals we eat, the people we talk to, ultimately what matters is what we leave for the future and our posterity. And I think that's how I see my personal life, and that's how I encourage other people to intervene as well. See your life from the standpoint of what effect it's going to have 500 to 1,000 years from now. And Lyndon LaRouche had this idea of a simultaneity of eternity, but if you don't mind me asking, Helga, for you to kind of elaborate on this idea, I think it would be important for people to reflect on this as well. I don't do this for myself. I don't know if I will see in my lifetime a future free of genocide and war, but I know that I have to fight for one anyway, because I know it will come. So, yeah.
Well, I can respond to this question. Actually, it is very important, because if you look back in history, the fact that the human species has come to the point where we are today, which is 8 billion people, enormous breakthroughs in science and technology. I mean, actually, a beautiful world is in reach. Then you have to be conscious of the fact that we came that far is the result of many individuals who had the courage to go against the odds of their time. I mean, I can only mention such people as Jeanne d'Arc, or Nehru, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, many, many others. And it was each time, a personal courage to put the well-being of humanity or your nation or your whatever country above your immediate personal interest. And we should be eternally thankful to the long line of such individuals. But Nikolaus of Kous, the great thinker of the 15th century, he actually said something very interesting. He said that the equation is such that each person recapitulates the entire evolution of humanity up to that point in his own life. And that if you want to contribute something meaningful for the further development of mankind, you have to be very conscious of what that next step is. And I think we are, for the first time in history, in a situation where we are not just fighting for that this important issue or this national interest or whatever, but we are for the first time trying to fight for the continuous existence of the human species, which never has been threatened so much like right now, not even in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And many people agree that we are in a situation much more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I'm convinced, that if we can stop this war danger, and I can only say that many of the people, meeting in Washington and, pushing policies which are a certain prescription for the end of civilization, that, some of these people are clearly detached from reality. And I think what we do right now, if we succeed, and I think what Orban is doing and what other people are expressing also on this discussion, if we succeed, I'm optimistic that we can put this idea of geopolitical interest behind us. I, a couple of years ago, made my New Year's address the most important goal that we overcome geopolitics, because as long as we as a human species are in a position to say that we have a legitimate interest against another group of nations, we will be in this terrible straitjacket of going from one war to the next. And I think we really have to overcome that, because in the time of thermonuclear war, there can be no legitimate reason to have war. And we have to get out of this crisis with an understanding and with a security architecture which eliminates the danger of war for good and forever. So whatever you are planning to do in the rest of this summer, keep that in mind, and basically, have this kind of revolutionary spirit, which it's a commitment. It's not something which comes from the sky, or all of a sudden you are such a person. It's something you have to think about, and you have to think about what do you do with your life at a moment where all of humanity and its future existence is threatened. Are you intending to be part of the solution, or waste your life in that way? And you have to think it through, and then when the next opportunity comes, you become an organizer. It doesn't mean you risk your life every 5 minutes, but you risk your life in doing nothing right now. Because if you do nothing, then World War III will happen. And I think the dynamic we are on right now with this idea of bloc building, NATO versus Russia, China, and the global South, that has to be overcome. So I think you should think about it. What do you owe your parents, your grandparents, and all the other fighters for freedom in human history? And then think how you can connect your own identity to that long line and contribute something beautiful, so that we do have children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and that they can look.
Yeah, so we want to just, before we go to Harley, he'll give us some final remarks on this, go back again to this International Peace Coalition Declaration of Independence from Imminent Nuclear War. Begin negotiations for peace now. Just to quote part of it and encourage you to go and pick it up from the Schiller Institute site. It says, time is of the essence. Any further escalation heightens the danger that the present conflagration will escalate to the level of region-wide war, or even thermonuclear confrontation, and that far more quickly than might be imagined. To ensure that this does not happen, we should follow this advice. Let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate. Let both sides explore what problems unite us, instead of belaboring those problems which divide us. These words of American President John F. Kennedy were echoed by his adversary, Russian Premier Nikita Khrushchev, in a letter that Khrushchev wrote to JFK. Quote, I have participated in 2 world wars and know that war only ends when it has carved its way across cities and villages, bringing death and destruction in its wake. That has been the unnecessary toll in this Ukraine war, a war that could have concluded over 2 years ago by the end of March of 2022. Instead, through the clearly documented intervention of the United Kingdom's Boris Johnson and NATO, the already negotiated proposal for peace between Russia and Ukraine was scuttled. Hundreds of thousands of lives were unnecessarily sacrificed as a result. So we wanted to make sure that people had a sense of why we want that circulated and why we want people to sign. And if you go to the site, you'll see a list of the signatories there. So Harley, I wanted to come back to you and give you any chance to both respond to what you hear from Helga and Jose, and also final remarks for the day.
Well, I want to go back to something from the period I was talking about, the 90s, and an example of how an individual can intervene and change the course of history. And now I'm going to talk about 2 people. One was a Russian who became the, I believe, Prime Minister, Primakov, who was very much involved in trying to communicate to the United States that it's the assurances that they've been giving of non-expansion that he doesn't believe, that the Russians don't believe, and they see that as a threat. Now, what he said at that time is that in 1997, he wrote a memo in which he said that the plan to invite Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary to join would be seen by the Russian people as a threat. Now, what Primakov did after that was very interesting. He presented an idea of a Russia-India-China alliance, saying that in order to overcome the power of the United States and its control over the non-sovereign nations of Europe, but the power of the United States militarily, financially, and combined with Europe, to overcome it, you needed an alternative to that, another, at that time, you might say another pole. And he proposed a Russia-India-China alliance. Lyndon LaRouche picked up on that, but he said that you should include a fourth country, namely the United States. And he drafted eventually what became known as his four powers proposal, that you have Russia, India, China, and the United States. And of course, later this became the BRICS. But the idea would be that you need enough physical economic power, not just military. Russia has military power, probably more than the United States. But Lynn was concerned with the idea of the physical economic capability of a nation to provide not only for its own population, but for its allies, and that could work together with other countries for mutual benefit. And that became the core idea of what we're seeing today with the emergence around the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Organization of Islamic Countries, and several other of these regional alliances. The idea is that every sovereign nation deserves the right to develop in its own way for the benefit of its people. And if it's done properly, the people will be very much involved in it because it can't be done from the top down. So here you have Primakov in a moment when Russia was being destroyed, putting forward an alternative idea that was then picked up by Lyndon LaRouche and became the basis of this potential today for a new order. And of course, this includes the development in China of the Belt and Road Initiative and so on. So the point being what Garland was talking about each individual taking seriously their potential to do something, what Jose was talking about, what Helga responded to, that this is what defines the specific, unique quality of human beings, that each of us is capable of developing in our own mind ideas that are truthful and communicating those ideas to others to inspire them to act on them and to discover them for themselves. That's what real education is, and that's what organizing is. And so I think just giving this example can show you the way Lyndon LaRouche approached the world. The idea being that he once said, when given two bad choices, always take the third. And we now have a third choice. And it's not a multipolar versus a unipolar. It's a world in which sovereign nations work together for mutual benefit. And each person watching this program today can become a part of that.
Harley Schlanger, thank you very much for joining us today. We also want to thank Garland Nixon, who's radio commentator. You can always catch him on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. We want to thank everybody that joined us and is with us as of even right now, and just leave you with a couple of thoughts. You know, back in the 1960s, Malcolm X was asked once the question, well, what is the price of freedom? And his answer was, the price of freedom is death. It's a useful little tape to see, because what he's talking about is the need for people to fight for their freedom. He says that's the price. Well, we can put it a little differently. let's say that the price of freedom is immortality. And there's something important to be thinking about concerning the American people today, tonight, as we look at the population and its leaders who are discussing everything except what they need to be discussing. There is no president of the United States right now. And right now, hour by hour, minute by minute, the nation and the world is in jeopardy as a result of that. But what do the American people do? We already had, if you saw the program, a little bit of a discussion about the 25th Amendment. And clearly, as was pointed out, there are problems with that. And there, more importantly, the real question is, who's running the country now? So in this circumstance, both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States require the citizens of the country to stand up and to declare their independence from whatever the oppression is, the conditions of oppression are that confront them, that whenever any government becomes destructive of the ends of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. And if you have a long train of abuses that pursue the object of reducing the people to absolute despotism, it's not only their right, it is their duty to throw off such government. Now, we are under some form of government. It isn't the one that you elected, and it isn't the one that the Constitution provides for, but it is there. And the interesting matter that comes up here is, what are you and I going to do about it? What are we as individuals going to do about it? Because we are vested with the power that is given to us as citizens of the United States, which is a greater power than many people, not merely many people even in governments in other parts of the world have. And that's what we want to point out, that the issue here is that there's the posterity of the country. In the preamble of the Constitution of the United States, written by Gouverneur Morris, he talks about the idea of the general welfare of ourselves and our posterity. So the issue of our actions today, and in the context of what everybody saw from the mental collapse of the president, is that we are required to act and to find a way to act. We're not left with no recourse. I mean, there's a constitution that fully outlines what's supposed to happen. And we are, in one sense, freest last generations of people who ever walked on the face of the earth, actually. But then again, that's a question of whether that's what the identity that you accept, or were you willing to pay the price of freedom? It's not a question of physical elimination. It's not a question of anything like that. The question is immortality. And that's the idea that we have to think about. In other words, whether we talk about that from the standpoint of figures from the past to which we think we are accountable, or people of the future that we will never know to which we think we are accountable. That's got to be the way that we operate. And so thank everybody for joining us for this. And we will see you again next week.